Welcome to Studio Ghibli Weekly. I'm Ira Kriesman.
And I'm Drew Kriesman.
And on this episode, we're going to get into Lupin III, Castle of Cagliostro. This is not, in fact, a Studio Ghibli movie, but it is a Hayao Miyazaki movie. So, Drew, why don't you tell us a little bit about Miyazaki's directorial debut?
Yeah, like you said, written and directed by Hayao Miyazaki, though there is also a screenplay credit for Haruya Yamazaki. It was released on December 15th in Japan in 1979.
Goodness. Older than us.
Yeah, right? Not a Studio Ghibli movie, if you want to, in the immortal words of the Mad Hatter, start at the beginning. We have to go to this is the seed of Studio Ghibli, as you mentioned, the debut. How about this debut from Hayao Miyazaki? Certainly the person we will be talking about most often throughout this series of episodes. Few interesting production notes on this one. I'm not the most knowledgeable on the history of voice actors. I'm trying to get better and better on that, but I did note that in the English version that most people have heard of, that was re-released by Manga Entertainment in 2000, Arsène Lupin, our guy, we'll get into that, is voiced by David Hayter, who is much more famously the voice of Solid Snake throughout most of that character's history. My Solid Snake. No offense to Kiefer Sutherland. I don't know most of the rest of these voice actors, though they all did a fantastic job. Again, as I was just kind of referencing, there have been multiple releases of this. It didn't get a huge wide release in 1979, even in Japan. You know, these movies were still a little bit more of a niche audience. It did get a wider release in the 90s. The first time it was released in English was in 1991 by Streamline Pictures with a whole different voice cast that you can find. And like I said, eventually coming out when there was a bit of a renaissance of this stuff and in a wide release so that most of us could find it in April of 2000. And that's the version that, you know, we're mostly going to be talking about here. It's the one that's been reviewed and all of that most often. And speaking of its reviews, it's got a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, for those of you that are interested in those kinds of things. Yeah. How about that?
I tend to, Rotten Tomatoes is a bit of a parody of itself at this point in some ways, but every once in a while it's nice to look at it and say, oh, okay. I mean, at least that's a number we can look at.
Right. I was saying, kind of the disjointed nature of the releases of this make it difficult to tell how much money it really made in terms of box office gross. Honestly, not a ton. It's not really considered a smash box office success by any means. Again, a lot like the early Final Fantasy games that, you know, don't measure up to what like 7 would eventually do. You know, Miyazaki would get to making a lot of money on this stuff. It was very well reviewed at the time. You know, anyone who saw it obviously enjoyed it. And in hindsight is where you get most of the takes, the reception of the movie. And some of them are fantastic. Some of the most kind of bombastic praise for the movie. In January 2001, a Japanese magazine called Animage or Animanga, I don't know, Animage, I think, elected Castle of Cagliostro the 9th best anime production of all time.
Nice.
Chris Beveridge of Anime on DVD.com gives the film a grade of A+. The Castle of Cagliostro placed 5th place on Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs list of best anime.
Cool.
And it was named the best Japanese animated film of all time by the Japanese film magazine Kineme Junpo in 2009. And then an American reference that I use for a lot of things, a lot of MCU stuff and DC and Super Nerd stuff like that, in 2020, so most recently, Screen Rant, called The Castle of Cagliostro, the best movie ever made by Hayao Miyazaki.
Wow, that's a tough list to make.
Yeah, right.
Goodness.
I personally have it ranked somewhere, for those of you that are patrons of DC Productions, somewhere in the 30s of my all-time animated films, which is very, very high. There's lots of movies I love that didn't make it into the top 50. But that said, I do have other Hayao Miyazaki films rated much higher on my personal list. That said, I would also think it would be kind of weird if you as a writer and director peaked on your very first film.
Right, right. Also, from everything I've read, this movie was made in 7 months, Drew. A full animated feature in 7 months. That's insane.
That doesn't make sense. That's wild to me that that's even possible, especially considering that this really does hold up very well, even under modern scrutiny. There's some things that don't. We'll get into that. But for the most part, it holds up really well. And I think part of that may be, like another thing we've liked to talk a lot about on another show, Final Fantasy VII in particular, but a lot of the games in the Final Fantasy franchise, you see their influence in a lot of other things, which helps keep them fresh when you go back and watch the original. In fact, Castle of Cagliostro has been cited as an influence on Indiana Jones, particularly Raiders of the Lost Ark. All the treasure hunting and a lot of the plots devices are very similar in that movie. But those of us who are big animated movie fans or animated show fans have seen homage to one of the most famous scenes in Castle of Cagliostro, being the clock tower scene. That's all I'll say for now. Has been paid homage to in one of our favorites as kids, the 1986 Disney movie, The Great Mouse Detective. There's also a clock tower fight scene in the episode of Batman the Animated Series, The Clock King. So, yeah, that we see some of these tropes coming back, whether it's the gentleman thief or the kind of mystery and treasure hunting and adventure mixed with a little bit of those fantasy elements that we like so much. There's a great, and even the music, as you and I were just talking about before we came on here, whether it's in animated film or video games or even just adventure storytelling in general, this movie, and of course on the what would ultimately be the career of Hayao Miyazaki, this movie has had a huge impact.
So let's talk a bit about the history, but real quick. There are these 5 characters. There's Lupin, who the series is named after. He's the gentleman thief. There's his buddy, almost sidekick / foil in Jigen, who is more of a scruffy sharpshooter type. Goemon is a sort of wandering samurai Ronin figure. Fujiko is another foil to Lupin. She is a lady thief in very similar style. Like she's constantly competing with him, might be in love with him, but definitely they're it's on again, off again if it's love in that way. And the last character who often appears is Inspector Zenigata, who works for Interpol and is always trying to arrest Lupin. And we will, as the characters appear in the movie, we'll go through and talk about their roles. I also want to make it clear that we are using, like you talked about, the version that's available on Netflix, which is also the version, the DVD that I have. And we're not going to get too much like with when we talk about Final Fantasy, we're not going to get too much into the translation, sub versus dub. I think there's some interesting takes on translation and the art of translation and what gets lost and what gets added and how those choices are made. But I'm not a translator, and mostly I find that it largely tells much the same story, and I don't need to get too much into those weeds.
Yeah, we're going to focus much more on, as we always do, the themes and the characters and, our reaction to the experience as it is more than what it could be, or, this stuff that we do up front is as behind the scenes as we tend to get.
So speaking of translations and various versions and the oral tradition and stories, there is a version of Lupin connected to LeBlanc's Lupin, not Monkey Punch's Lupin, which is a French television show about a modern-day gentleman thief. And I've never seen this show, but your sister-in-law and our mother have. So maybe we could toss this conversation to them for a minute.
Yeah, let's make it a family affair.
Hi, Mom.
Hi, Ira.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Ira.
So, Mom, why don't you tell us a bit about the show? Like, what's the general premise?
The general premise is that there is this character, the main character, who patterns himself after a character he learned about in books called, Arsène Lupin. And you only, like lots of fictional things, you don't know that right away, but you start to learn about it. So that character was a master gentleman thief and master of disguise.
And you're referring to the literary character from...
The literary character was that, and then this new guy uses that character and how he did things to also become a master jewel thief, or thief in general.
And how did he come to know about the literary character?
His father borrowed a book from an important rich family that he worked for. He was the driver of the man of the house. And they had a really big library. And his wife one time said, "Feel free to take a book. We have lots here." And that's the one he chose.
So maybe this one's for Kelly. Would you describe this character as a gentleman thief?
I mean, yes, I would describe him as a gentleman thief, but also I think he has a little bit of a taste for vengeance, which sometimes is not part of that trope. He's trying to figure out who killed his father. Why that ended up being awful, his dad ended up getting sent to jail for stealing from the family he worked for.
Which wasn't true.
Sure.
Which wasn't true. He did not steal from that family. I didn't finish it yet, but there's a big conspiracy going on.
Right. And when he was a kid, I'm not remembering now, maybe he was 12 or 14 when his father died. Mm-hmm. He didn't know he was murdered. He knew he was in jail and he died in jail. But he didn't understand, and something never felt right. So at first, that's what he's trying to figure out. Mm-hmm. But how it appears that he's lived his life and made his money, which again isn't explained up front, is by being this gentleman thief. That he really did pull kind of amazing heists that nobody figured out.
Are there any other literary tropes, devices, connections, parallels you've noticed?
I think there's a little bit of a trope of the foreign person coming in to be part of the society and being kind of the lower class, and they all serve the upper class people. That's apparent throughout
His family was from
Cameroon?
Cameroon.
Senegal.
I said Senegal or Cameroon.
Yeah.
Right.
French Africa, post-colonial French Africa. And so they immigrate to France, and they work for this really wealthy family, and there is a little bit of the classism is taking place, which is a little bit like the gentleman thief and, like Robin Hood, sort of, like steal from the rich.
Right.
Kind of trope. So that's really interesting.
So that's going to be my next question. This guy's a thief. He's a criminal, right? Why do we root for him?
I think he's trying to take down the corruption, and he's trying to make his life better, his kids' life better. He's trying to right some wrongs that happened.
And that's what he knows and he's good at.
That's how he does it. That's how he can do it. So.
And if we haven't mentioned, because he was from French, African, whatever, he's a black man in France, and his father was obviously an immigrant, and he was too. And so that's always kind of there in the back of it, like the people they're working for and how they respect or don't respect them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's really interesting because he ends up getting sent to a boarding school on a scholarship. You find out later. Right. The wife feels guilty for how his dad was sent to prison and murdered in prison. And so he ends up going to an all-white boarding school, and there's lots of bullying around his race in his class at that boarding school.
And he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that when he's a kid. He doesn't find that out till later in this show, how that happened. He knows that it happened. And then the people that befriended him versus the people that were mean to him and bullying to him as kids. Mm-hmm. And how that has shaped his life.
So, how good is your French?
Mine is not very good anymore. I'm not sure it was ever really good. I took 2 years of French in high school, 2 years of French in college because you have to take foreign languages to graduate. My high school was all about conversational, and the college was all about reading and writing. So I'm like, yeah, I could ask some basic things, but that's about it these days. So I watched it in English with subtitles.
Okay. Kelly?
I took 4 years of French in high school and 2 years of French in college, and when I took it, it was all 4 modes of communication: speaking, listening, reading, and writing, which I would say I can get by. I'm better reading in French. I can read pretty fluently in French, but speaking it, I'm not as good.
So how do you watch the show?
I watch it with subtitles, and then I watch it without subtitles the second time.
So when you watch it the second time, is it in English dubbed or is it in French?
It's in French.
Okay.
So you watched it in French with English subtitles?
Yeah, in French with English subtitles, and then no subtitles, just in French.
Okay. And are you able to follow it?
Yeah, because it's the second time.
I was thinking about doing that too, yeah. If you know what happens, yeah.
It's way easier. Yeah.
So do you think that there is a method of watching a foreign film or show that is better? Is it just different? Do you have a preference?
I think if you know some of the language, it's probably better to watch it that way. I'm just not good enough. I've watched some French, I watched some Spanish, several Spanish shows, and I know some Spanish, but again, not enough to follow any big. And I've watched some from Istanbul.
Okay.
No language quality there whatsoever. Yeah.
All right.
I mean, I feel like if you can understand the first language, that's always better because there's lots of subtlety that you miss when it is dubbed. You never get a perfect translation. But on the other hand, if you can watch something that's not from your culture, even if it is dubbed, it is better than nothing.
Oh, I agree. And the shows that I've watched, there's 2 shows that take place in Istanbul that I've watched, The Protector and The Gift. And in The Protector, a lot of times, so I'm watching it dubbed in English, right? They will say something in a way that I think, do they really think we talk that way? Or do they really talk that way? You know, in that translation thing, it's just kind of awkward. It kind of seems like a macho American guy thingy. And I'm thinking, is that the way they picture us? Or that's just how they see it? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. Mm-hmm.
So that gets into the last topic I wanted to ask you guys about. So Mom, you watch a lot of foreign films and shows and such. So to both of you, what is the value of watching something that isn't in English or isn't American-centric? Or maybe put another way, what is the value of watching or reading world literature?
If we go back to the Lupin show, I think one of the most interesting things to me is some of the very basic things that other societies just do differently. Like the police in France are very much like police, but they operate a little differently. They take a little bit different perspective on things. I even watched a show out of Ireland, and just how the police detectives handle those things were different than we would expect our police to handle it. Mm-hmm. Based on our cop shows, not necessarily on real police, right? So the value is looking at that different perspective in the human characters.
I think it just opens a lot of possibilities into ways that you can do things differently, even in your own personal life. You know, we have a lot of space in America. We have big houses in America, and that's not the case in a lot of older cities. And so just seeing how people live differently can tell you that you don't have to live the way that you always expect to live, and it's still awesome. I think having those possibilities and having those perspectives really allows people to connect with each other on a better level from all different backgrounds. I probably will never meet somebody who lives in Western Colorado from Senegal, from where, but I would meet lots of people from not Western Colorado. And so having the ability to see different ways of life is really important, just so that you can connect to people from different areas and different cultures.
All right, was there anything else either of you wanted to say on the subject?
When you were talking about the different perspectives, I think so what I mentioned was just the people in their jobs, the functionary part of that, and how that can be different, even if it's generally the same, but subtleties, like Kelly was just talking about houses or any of the built environment. One of the things they do in this show is this guy, the main character, and this woman, they go on a motorcycle ride through Paris. And it's really, really neat. And you get that idea of being in a city like that, right? Mm-hmm. And the beauty of it, and just passing by simple day-to-day things, not just things like the Eiffel Tower.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. That was a lot of fun.
Good.
Absolutely. There's a Sean Connery movie called The Great Train Robbery. And if you look up the trailer, one of the first things they say is, can you tell us why you decided to engage in such a brazen act of thievery? And he says, because I wanted the money. And it's like, oh, right. Yeah, like part of the idea here is who has the money and why do they have it? Like why? So another thing is, why do we root for these guys who are clearly criminals? Well,
right.
We're thinking about Robin Hood, right? Prince John doesn't have the money because he's a good guy. He's got the money because he's stealing it from poor people, right? And then I'm thinking about pirates. We got Jack Sparrow,
sure,
the crew of the Firefly. There are lots of pirates in Final Fantasy. One of them is even a leading man.
Yeah.
And there will be pirates throughout various Miyazaki works too. I think about the rebels in Star Wars. I think about the Wild Rose Rebellion. They're rebelling not because the government does a good job, right?
Right, because the laws of the land are fair and just.
Exactly. And
ought to be followed.
Or even, let's think about some modern characters, right? Some like Bonnie and Clyde, real people, but also got this folkloric cast about them.
Right. Yeah.
Another big literary trope idea I want to think about is the power of belief. Because there's going to come a scene about halfway through where our gentleman thief tells the princess, you got to believe in the thief. And what is the power of that, even in what is basically a pretty grounded movie, except for all the things that aren't. But right, like it's still, there's not magic in this movie, but there are some things that defy certain laws of gravity. And so now I'm thinking about, remember that Nick Cage movie Adaptation?
Sure.
Where he plays the screenwriter Kaufman, and then his made-up twin brother.
Fictional twin brother, yeah.
And like,
I love that movie.
There comes a point in that where the other brother is saying, well, what if it suddenly became an action film and all this crazy stuff happened, and then that happens in the movie.
In the movie,
right?
Yeah.
Or other movie like Kick-Ass is a movie where things start off real small and just like punching each other, and by the end we've got jetpacks and rocket launchers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love some of the bending of reality that they do in this movie. Because like you said, it's not like magic and dragons and stuff like that, but there are, as I put it earlier, I think fantasy elements.
Sure.
It doesn't just ask that you suspend your disbelief. It's sort of from the get-go, through the way it's presented, demands that you suspend like certain concepts of reality in order to buy what they are visually telling you or whatever the themes are. And because it's so well done, I think it's just remarkably effective that you could watch this movie and be like, no, there weren't too many things in that were completely impossible. And then if you go back and you're looking for them, you're like, oh man, there's several times in here where people should have died.
Right.
So there's some Looney Tune physics at some times, but yeah, it's remarkably entertaining.
So maybe the phrase is magical realism.
Yeah, right. Yes.
So it is meant to be mostly pretty grounded, but every once in a while we do something that's obviously not possible.
Car drives up a mountain.
Sure, yeah. The last big question I want to talk about So we did, why did we root for the gentleman thief? What is the power of belief? The last one is, what is the value of world literature? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. And if you listen to the first episode, we get into it a bit. Mom and Kelly get into it a bit. And I'm not sure that we need to answer this right this moment. I'm not sure we ever need to answer it. But obviously, I have made my stake on the claim that it is important, if not, it is at the very least interesting, if not extraordinarily important, to look at stories outside what you're familiar with, to look at stories that have a basis outside one's own cultural expectations. And I feel like a lot of Japanese animation is drawing on a multicultural background, but is still fairly firmly rooted in its own expectations. And so this movie, I feel like, is a little more what's expected of a Western tradition, in that we got a good guy, we got a bad guy, we got a goal, but also there are going to be some moments where it's maybe a little more ambiguous, maybe not so much good and bad as yin and yang. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I want to just pull up an example because, as you were talking about, it's something I've been thinking about lately. And while this isn't necessarily about world lit, about diversity of thought as much as diversity of in any other variety that we talk about. And this is something that I think is being really missed by a lot of folks in the conversation around the Eternals movie, where there are a lot of people suggesting, hey, okay, diversity, but it's for diversity's sake. What is even the point? A study just came out recently that showed there's been a 250% increase in people learning sign language after going to watch
Excellent.
The Eternals, because there's a badass superhero now who uses sign language. And honestly, it's something that we should all know, quite frankly.
Sure.
It's something that should be taught, and if we can increase people's interest in it through a big-ass superhero movie, that stuff is great. And so it does have an impact on the culture and the society when people are exposed to ideas or cultures or just ways of living that they weren't necessarily exposed to before. So I would go beyond saying, it's important to be a well-rounded literary person, to go outside of the Western world and read and watch and listen to things from other traditions. It's potentially incredibly powerful to do so. I think both of us would say that it has been in our lives, that being exposed to a lot of this stuff that's not Western ideology in our youth has impacted, our kind of world. It's so bad that, and then just give you a different, it's so bad that what, and they can all be a different funny. And this was like, they were seriously a challenge themselves to see how many different comedic ways they could have a car fall apart. The guy's driving, just the front half of it as the back half falls off.
And then one of them will explode in confetti, or yeah.
Right. They were just like, okay, and then what? Yeah, okay, what's the next one do? Oh, I've got it. It's so good.
So I love this scene because it does a great job of introducing our characters and what they're all about. They're thieves. They're very spry, maybe even, if not superhuman, at the peak of human ability. They think ahead, right? They're sabotaging these cars.
Definitely.
And they drive off in this tiny little car. I looked it up. It's a Fiat 500, and it's got the engine in the back, and it's got this sunroof, and they just jam themselves and these giant bags of cash in there, and off they go, and they get away.
And it's very like clown car. There's way too much cash,
right?
Not enough car.
Exactly. So even though we've kind of done it already, we like to stop and do a character study now and again. So Lupin is the slick thief. He's the charmer. He's charismatic. His hair is always slicked back. He's got big dreams. He's a schemer. He wears that bright teal suit, but oftentimes in the other anime, he'll be wearing a bright red suit. So he stands out, even though he's also a master of disguise, which we'll discuss here in a bit.
Right.
Jigen is scruffy. He's often smoking. He's the support character, but he's also not afraid to tell Lupin that he's full of shit.
Yeah.
He's kind of a scrapper. He's a sharpshooter. He uses firearms, whereas I don't think Lupin ever does in this movie. Yeah. And he's got that really cool hat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally the Fiat, the little yellow car. Apparently Lupin drove like a Maserati or a Mercedes. I don't know. He drove a longer, fancier car in most of the other anime, and this is where the Fiat first appears. It's a 1957 Fiat. It's bright yellow. It's got that sunroof, barely any elbow room, as you were saying. Too many elbows, not enough car.
Yeah.
And it's minuscule compared to every other car in the movie. But just like our heroes, it's maneuverable, it's scrappy. It's going to take a beating here in a minute, and it's still running at the end.
Yeah.
So, like you were saying, the car's filled with money, and our heroes are ecstatic. But Lupin, who's driving, happens to realize, oh, it's counterfeit. It's all fake. He gets this intent look on his face. He's like, You know what I think we should do? I think we should take over the counterfeit operation. And so they toss the money out of the car. Onto this crowded highway, by the way.
Right. Oh, man. You got to love that because, and we talked about this before about how James Bond will often be introduced with, like, the end of the last mission or, we're getting, and that's what we're getting here is they're finishing this mission and then, then they move on to the next thing. But that they did it successfully and then it didn't matter.
Right.
They completely got away with it and then just went, oh, we don't need this, and just tossed it.
Because
that's good stuff.
Because this sets them up further, right? So now we've got the goal. We're going to go take over the counterfeiting enterprise. But also, what's more interesting? Having a bunch of money that we could probably still use because these counterfeits are so good as to be used in a casino, or is the point the challenge?
Right.
And for these guys, I think the point is the challenge. Certainly for Lupin, it is.
Yeah.
Then we get this beautiful intro piece. I should point out that the composer